Hitchhiking, especially when traveling alone, is always risky. However, when a young couple with a small child stops to give you a ride, it's hard to imagine that the trip will lead to an unimaginable hell instead of your intended destination. Colleen Stan considered herself an experienced hitchhiker at the age of 20. In 1970, hitchhiking was a common practice. Sometimes it was even the only means of transportation. Of course, she had heard about different cases. Sometimes the stories were so frightening that Colleen told herself it would be the last time. Little did she know that her story would become, without exaggeration, one of the most shocking. Up until then, luck had always been on her side. Her main rule was not to get into the car of the first driver who stopped. Colleen mostly rode with elderly couples and women. On May 19, 1977, Colleen Stan was hitchhiking on the road. She wanted to surprise her friend by arriving at her birthday party in a neighboring state. This meant she had to travel over 550 kilometers from her hometown of Eugene, Oregon, to Red Bluff in Northern California. She had already turned down 2 drivers, carefully choosing whose passenger to become. In the third car that stopped, there was a young couple with a small child. They seemed very friendly and said they would be happy to take her to Red Bluff. When Colleen got into the car, her fellow passengers introduced themselves. The driver was 23-year-old Cameron Hooker, and sitting next to him was his 19-year-old wife, Janice, with their little daughter. Along the way, they stopped at a gas station to refuel and use the restroom. Cameron Hooker was born in Alturas, California, in 1953. Former classmates and teachers remembered him as a happy child, cheerful and sociable, someone who enjoyed teasing other students. Sometimes his jokes were quite cruel, but children often lack empathy. The Hooker family settled in Red Bluff in 1969, and during that time, Cameron's personality underwent noticeable changes. He became withdrawn and avoided social activities, nothing unusual in that, as Cameron was far from the first teenager to go through such a phase of introversion. No incidents or traumatic events were found in his life. When Cameron met his future wife, Janice, his inclination towards sadism began to surface. Janice was only 15 when she met 19-year-old Cameron. The guy seemed so mature. By then he was already working in a sawmill. The teenage girl felt insecure and admitted that she was delighted that a guy who was older than her was showing interest in her. She fell in love, she said, with the tall, slender, and handsome then Cameron. She herself admitted that for the sake of keeping him, she was willing to do anything. One day Cameron asked if he could hang her from a tree with leather handcuffs. He said he had done it before with his other girlfriends. Everyone loved it. Young Janice agreed. The experience scared the girl a lot, but Cameron was so affectionate and attentive afterward that he was able to make amends and allay any fears. Cameron Hooker and Janice married in 1975. Sadomasochistic acts expanded to include hitting, choking, and scuba diving. On one occasion, Cameron nearly killed his young wife. Janice gave birth to a daughter in 1976, and she was actually, hard to believe, happy in that marriage. The first girl to fall victim to this terrible compromise was Mary Elizabeth Spanhake, nicknamed Merly Eyes. Merly Eyes moved to California from Cleveland, Ohio in late 1975. She was living with her fiancé and working part-time modeling at a camera store. She was only 19 years old when she was spotted by Cameron and Janice walking down Mangrove Avenue. The girl was clearly in a hurry to get somewhere, and the couple offered her a ride. Merly Eyes agreed. They drove to Rio Linda Boulevard. As the girl started to get out of the car, Cameron grabbed her wrist and pulled her back in. Pulling out a knife, he told her to ride with them. They brought the captive back to their home and dragged her into the basement. Cameron tortured Merly Eyes and then strangled her. They buried her body near Layson Park in their hometown. In spite of what had happened, Janice stayed with her husband, and moreover, she accepted a new slave. The drive was long, monotonous, and the conversations quieted down. The car suddenly turned into a secluded, wooded area. Before Colleen could realize it, Cameron was in the back seat next to her, holding a knife to her throat. He placed a 9-pound wooden special box he had made himself over her head. The head box he designed blocked sound and light. At night, they reached their home. Over the next few hours, Colleen was subjected to the most severe torture. Cameron, obsessed with his repulsive desires, set up a veritable torture chamber in the basement of his home. According to the agreement with his wife, he could not rape his victim, but over time the agreement changed and Cameron began to include rape in his forms of torture. The day after all the abuse, Cameron put the girl in a wooden box resembling a coffin. Sometimes she was in this box for up to 23 hours a day. She would only get out of there when Cameron wanted to continue his abuse. Every time the lid of the box was opened, Colleen experienced a very strange mixture of feelings. It was hard for her to breathe. She was given almost no water inside. Despite the high temperature inside the coffin, she was not allowed to eat. She was afraid that her captors would wall her up in that box forever, so when she heard the sound of the lock opening, she felt relief at first, which was quickly replaced by horror. Her knees were shaking, blood was pounding in her temples. She did not know what to expect today. The search for Colleen didn't begin until 4 days later, thanks to friends in Eugene. The parents were sure that their daughter was in California, and the friend did not even know that Colleen was going to her, as it was a surprise for her. The search was complicated by the long distance the girl was missing. Moreover, there are several routes from Eugene to Red Bluff. Nothing could be ascertained at that time. In the Hooker family home, everything at first glance went like a normal young family. Janice sat with her young daughter, and Cameron went to work, but only after work he regularly took Colleen to the basement. Months of unbearable existence, torture, alternating with being in a coffin for almost 24 hours, hunger, constant humiliation, lack of clothes. In early 1978, Cameron told Colleen that he was a member of a satanic organization called The Company. An influential, ruthless gang that kept tabs on her and her family home was bugged to this day. Of course, it was all fiction, just to intimidate and further subjugate the victim. Cameron made Colleen sign a document stating that she would become his slave forever. According to the contract, she is obligated to provide her entire being to her slave master's every desire. If she broke the slave contract and ran away, the company would find her. Colleen's name was changed to Kay, and she was forced to call Cameron master. She was not allowed to drink, eat, or speak without permission. Cameron fantasized that Colleen was the female heroine of a French erotic novel that was published in 1954, The Story of O, one of his favorite books. In 1978, the Hooker family and their captive family arrived in a large mobile home with an outbuilding behind the yard. Cameron built a new wooden box for Colleen. It was ventilated and built into the bottom of the couple's bed. This was not done by accident. Cameron wanted Colleen to be involved in all the details of the couple's private life. In 1978, Janice gave birth to their second daughter on this bed while Colin was underneath it. After a year of living in a wooden coffin, daily torture and intimidation by her master, the girl was already so malleable that Cameron felt he could trust his slave girl. She was now free to walk around the house. She was allowed to wear clothes and eat normally. Colleen did household chores, helping Janice care for the children. Hooker's daughters saw her as a nanny. Colleen never denied it. In the evenings, she climbed into her drawer. The children, naturally, did not know about it. They did not know where the nanny slept or what happened to her at night. Later, Colleen was even allowed to go outside. The neighbors were also sure that Colleen babysat at the Hooker house. Colleen never asked them or anyone else for help. Being in front of open doors, she never thought of running away. She had access to a phone at all times. She was very afraid to even imagine what the company would do to her as punishment for running away. One day, Cameron told Colleen that he was planning something really grand. He wanted to create a slave dungeon where many girls would be kept. Now Colleen was helping him dig a hole in a place hidden from the neighbors. In 1980, Cameron allowed Colleen to call Colleen at home. He said that the company would listen in on this call. The girl must not complain, tell them where she was, and of course ask for help. It was her little sister Bonya she was talking to. Bonya was so amazed, she started asking her sister questions. Colleen assured her sister that she was fine, asked her not to look for her and not to turn anywhere. After this call, Colleen's family did not go to the police. They decided that the girl had become part of a religious cult and it was her decision. The parents were not close to their daughter. In her hitchhiking trips, she often ran away from them. Despite her still very young age, she had already disappeared for quite long periods, though not that long. The family believed in their relationship. At that moment, the parents believed that their daughter and Michael, the alias Cameron had invented for himself, were in a cult. Cameron so intimidated his victim and realized it that he was not afraid to leave Colleen in her family for 24 hours, saying that he had an important meeting and would pick her up tomorrow. The sisters said that they and their parents were afraid to pressure Colleen, to question and convince her of anything, so as not to push her further away. She was just starting to make contact with them that they didn't want to risk losing her at all. Michael promised his parents before he left that they would have a home with Colleen soon, and he would give them the address. For the last time, the parents even took a photo of the fake couple looking just as fake happy. When their little girl left, they again did nothing about it. After this visit, Colleen's life got even worse, if such a thing can even be imagined. Cameron began to worry that he had given her too much freedom, so he immediately locked her in a crate. Eating was forbidden again, moving around the house too. Colleen was in that makeshift coffin all day long. It was especially hard in the summer when it was very stuffy and hot, despite the ventilation. Cameron tortured her when the kids went to bed. So a couple more years went by like that. For 2 whole years, she didn't even see sunlight in her wooden box. In 1983, Cameron again allowed Colleen to move freely around the house and even the yard. Neighbors and children were sure the nanny was back. Cameron softened his attitude toward the victim. After a while, he told Janice that Colleen would be living in the house as a second wife. A little later, Colleen was even able, with Cameron's permission, to get a job at the motel as a maid. Now the girl was working, seeing the neighbors all the time. She was in contact with a lot of people, but she continued to believe in surveillance and no one knew about her horror story. In the same year Janice became interested in Christianity. She read the Bible, began to pray. She knew that Colin was very devout, and when Cameron was at work, in his free time, they read the Bible together, so they became close. Cameron, upon learning this, began letting Colleen and Janice go to church on Sundays. Colleen saw Janice's heart opening up to her. After another year, Janice decided she would help Colleen escape. Some believe it was jealousy. Janice loved her husband very much with her love-sick love and didn't want him to have a second wife. But judging by the following events, it was her faith that made her do so. Anyway, on August 9, 1984, Janice told Colleen that there was no company, that no one was coming for her. Janice asked Colleen not to tell anyone what had happened to her. The woman hoped that if Colleen left their home, Cameron would become a normal person, too. Unlike J.C. Dugard, who denied in every way possible that she was experiencing Stockholm Syndrome, Colleen Stan is a prime example of this psychological condition. Yes, she was intimidated, but when she found out there was no company, she gave Cameron a chance to get better. She even called him from the bus stop. She told him she was leaving. He cried. She called him a lot at first. It sounds unbelievable, but this is how the Stockholm Syndrome manifests itself. The victim becomes attached to his tormentor, takes an interest in his fate, asks either to commute his sentence or not to punish him at all, visits him in detention centers, and so on. In any case, Colleen did not say anything to anyone. She came home after 7 long years spent in endless agony. She just went back without answering any questions, and no one would ever know about it until the following happened. Janice had hoped that she and her husband would finally have a normal life, but her plans never seemed destined to come true. Cameron dreamed of a dungeon with prisoners, a new torture chamber. Janice never told what made her do this, but it seems that after all these years, her conscience awoke in her. On November 8, 1984, Janice asked her pastor if she could confess. Frank Debney, the pastor of the church, noticed that Janice was very nervous. What he then heard was unimaginable to him. He said it should be reported to the police, and they did so together. 4 days after these events, the police contacted Colleen. Colleen was acting so calm that the police didn't even believe the story at first, thinking Janice was crazy trying to lie about her husband, probably because of cheating or something. Cameron Hooker was taken into custody after all. The horror story was later confirmed. An incredible amount of evidence was found. It was different torture devices, photos of Colleen during torture, hundreds of BDSM magazines. Janice also spoke about the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Mary Elizabeth Spanhake. The authorities were never able to find her remains. Cameron was only charged in the Colleen Stan case. Janice Hooker testified against her husband in exchange for full immunity. Cameron pleaded not guilty. The torturer's lawyer claimed it was consensual. They were a couple, traveling to Colleen's parents' house. All the surrounding people saw more than once the girl on the street without him. She voluntarily returned home after work. The prosecutor showed a contract signed by Colleen, which proved that the girl did not belong to herself. After Colleen's own testimony, people cried in the courtroom. Some jurors couldn't sleep after the horrific details the girl had to recount. But Cameron's lawyer had another trump card up his sleeve. It was Colleen's love letters to Cameron. Colleen had never told anyone about them before. She wrote that she was falling harder and harder in love. It was really written by her. It wasn't written under threats. Cameron said he kidnapped the girl, but later she fell in love with him and it was consensual. But still, what the girl had to endure was taken into account. She nurtured feelings of affection and even love in herself so that she would not have to go through the agony of rape every day. This is a psychological defense mechanism. A perfectly acceptable human reaction to a highly traumatizing event. Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison. In 2015, 61-year-old Cameron Hooker applied for parole under California's parole program. He was denied, and there will be no parole hearing on his case for 15 years. There are several other similar stories that occurred during this period when hitchhiking became a nightmare for real. Robert Ben Rhodes was born in 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Only 3 murders committed by him have been proven. Robert Ben Rhodes drove a truck. His van was set up as a torture chamber. He is suspected of brutally murdering over 50 women between 1975 and 1990. Matching the years of his murderous activities, the routes of his mobile slaughterhouse with the places where the women disappeared. Before his abuse, he sometimes photographed his victims. He is credited with the famous photograph of Regina K. Walters before her death in an old barn. Kemper Edmund Emile III was born December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. On May 7, 1972, he agreed to drive 2 female students, Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Mary Lucchesa, from the city of Berkeley to Stanford. At first it was business as usual, but after an hour of driving, Edmund got out of the car, grabbed Mary, and raped her on the ground outside the car. The second girl was in the back seat in the closed car the whole time. Edmund killed Mary first, and then he killed Anita. He forced the bodies into the car and brought them home. Edmund Emile Kemper was a necrophiliac. In September of that year, he killed 15-year-old Aiko Koo, whom he then dismembered. Edmund later killed 18-year-old Sydney, whom he cut off her head and buried in the backyard. It turned out that he came to the place very often to talk to her. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu were also his victims. There are times when everything on the road goes as normal, but then the driver returns to future victims. In 1982, Grettir Sigurd Arneson picked up 2 sisters, Yvette and Marie Bohat, and drove them all the way home. When night fell, Grettir returned to the sisters, Marie killed, Yvette tortured for several hours and then also killed. After the trial, Colleen Stan was completely free of the addiction she had felt all her life to Cameron Hooker. She stopped contacting him as well as his wife. She almost immediately went to study accounting, got a job after her studies, got married, and had a daughter. Colleen Stan is married for the 4th time and is raising her grandson, who is about 7 years old. She is now helping women recover from similar horrific incidents that have happened to them.